Today's the day that we finish the vest we've been working on, so that yours will end up looking like this one, or perhaps like this one. New Zealand's famous and reclusive supermodel, Grant, has already completed his vest and was good enough to send us video of it being modeled. This vest was knitted with locally available yarn on the Bulky 8 machine. Fantastic job, Grant. Because the yarn is so bulky, we want to make some adjustments in the methods that we use for sewing it up. The main yarn does not lend itself to use for assembly. It's too thick and too likely to pull apart. So I suggest finding a much thinner, say fingering weight yarn, and use it for the sewing. Our main yarn is multicolored, so I selected this soft gray, and it blends in adequately well. We need to sew the side seams and the shoulder seams. Side seams will extend from the ribbing at the underarm all the way through the ribbing at the hem. Shoulder seams will include the top ends of the armhole ribbings and also join the front collar band to the back. Remember, we knitted the back straight on, so that needs to be seamed. If you have followed the videos just as given, you will want to seam right behind your bind-off. Advanced knitters may want to release the bind-off and graft the shoulders together for an even flatter look. If you undo the bind-off and graft, you will still need to sew the ribbing ends together. And if that's your choice and you knit future vests, you will want to change that little part of the instructions to scrapping off rather than binding off. Reducing bulk in the seams of this sweater is one major reason why we select an alternate yarn to assemble with. The sweater is already so bulky, I don't think anybody wants a stiff, ultra-thick seam. And with that in mind, I suggest avoiding two very common and popular seams, backstitch and chain stitch, because both of them involve extra trips with the yarn, and they're unnecessary trips in this instance. So let's select either mattress stitch or one of two types of seams that involve sewing together the knots at the end of alternate rows of machine knitted fabric. I'm demonstrating on some hats because the seams will be easier for you to understand in a solid color. These hats are part of my charity knitting contribution for the year. And first I will show you mattress stitch. On all of these, I am utilizing a yarn that doesn't match at all, so that you will have an easier time following it. But actually, it doesn't harm the look of the hat. You can barely see it, certainly not from the outside, so I'm going to just leave it in. Mattress stitch involves going either into the very edge column of stitches or next to the very edge column of stitches and stitching under the bar that connects them all. My usual favorite way is to go next to an entire column. I find it easier to do neatly and to find my opening. However, that will reduce the size of this vest by more than an inch. So keep that in mind if it's your choice, and it would not be quite as flat. That is what I was doing here. As you can see, mattress stitch is close to invisible, even with contrasting thread. I have to pull the seam apart to get a look at it. On machine knitted fabrics, the very edges alternate between what we call knots that are tight and longer strands of yarn that we call bars. Sewing the knots together with one of several methods will give a nice tight seam that lays quite flat on the outside, though it does show a bit on the inside. So if we go through the first knot on one side and through the first knot on the second side, just whip stitching, that's one way of doing it. This seam is best worked from the wrong side of the fabric. From the outside, it's very discreet, and from the inside, it looks like this, only usually you don't see a different color of yarn. Here's the seam I selected for the sample. We'll also be sewing knots together in this one. There's a knot, there's a bar, and I'll skip it, but we'll work from the outside and come up from the inside, finding the next knot on one side and poking up through it, then taking the needle across to the opposite piece of edge, poking up through the next knot, and progressing up or down the fabric in that manner. The path of the needle starts by punching up through the back or the wrong side of the fabric and making sure to go into knots, not to bars. It takes a little bit more concentration. It does look nice, and I often stop and check to make sure that I'm choosing the correct spot. This seam is very discreet from the right side, very hard to spot. And from the wrong side, it looks quite similar to when we whip stitch knots together, but the path of the thread is different. Using either of the seams whereby we join knots, no fabric width is lost into the seam. To neaten up the bottom of the V-neck, the length of the ribbing, which is the edge of the ribbing, should sew to bound off edges at the bottom of the neckline. Ladies, overlap the right piece of ribbing over the left, gentlemen, the left over the right, at least in the US. So the overlapped ribbing to the outside of the garment, covering the bind off. So the underlapped piece of ribbing on the inside of the garment to the same area, also covering the bound off stitches. There is no need to stitch all the way through the fabric. Let the ribbing pieces sandwich the bind off for the neatest possible finish. Shallow stitches with either the yarn that you use to sew the side seams or even sewing thread to match are enough to do a neat and sturdy job and don't create extra bulk here. Weaving in. We might normally work these yarn tails into these nearby stitches or the backs of them, but with yarn as thick as this, I think an alternate method is preferable. I'm using a neutral color of sewing thread and stitching it down with tiny stitches. In this case, we're very near the seam where the body of the garment and the armhole ribbing join, so I stitched to the seam, but not through the seam. The stitches do not go through to the front. The yarn tail is simply anchored to the interior of the seam and then the excess of it trimmed off. We might have gotten by with traditional weaving in since we were on the seam of the other piece. But here where we needed to change yarns in mid-row in order to keep the color sequence working properly, that would really be a problem. And that's when this technique of sort of darning our tail to the back of the fabric without going through to the front with the stitches really is important and useful. We absolutely do not want to see a big bump on the front, and we really would be likely to do so should we weave yarn of this kind of thickness into the fabric. So I'm making very shallow stitches with my neutral yarn, sewing thread, trying to catch the yarn tail as it falls and keep about an inch of it intact. Now that I have that inch tacked down, I can afford to trim so I have easier access. Maybe those need sharpening. As it is, it's probably safe and would not come apart. But I like to be really cautious. And one reason that I do is that I ran an alterations business for 30 plus years. And one of my most common alterations wasn't an alteration at all. It was repairing sweaters where the yarn tails of beautifully hand knitted pieces had come apart. And because I understood how the knitted fabric was constructed, I could knit up the runs and secure them. Made good money doing it. It's not glorious work, but it's practical and necessary, and it was a good thing to know. But some of the things that I repaired were such beautiful things. Well done by skilled hand knitters, some with high-end labels in them. That's why I am now so careful about fastening down loose fibers. I think we're about there, and I confess I don't love the way this looks from the wrong side, but wait till you see how it doesn't show at all from the right side. Now you just can't tell that I've been working there. It even hangs right. There it is, I can feel it. But it doesn't even make a stiff spot if you're very gentle with how much of the knitted fabric you actually anchor to. So I hope your vest comes out beautiful and you knit many more. Bye now.